Has God called you to do the work of the ministry, but yet you're frustrated with the results that you're seeing? Frustration is a dangerous time for those in the ministry, because with the frustration comes the temptation to quit. If that's you, I invite you to join in on today's session of Leadership on the Run. Good morning. If you're watching this series, I am making the assumption that you are involved in church ministry in some form or fashion. And at some point in your ministry, there will be a time that you will become frustrated. Any leader gets frustrated when those that are under their influence don't seem to follow at the same level that they wish they would. And first off, I want you to understand that I get it. Ministry is hard. It can be frustrating at times. I was presented with some stats recently, and I thought it to be very profound and wanted to share it with you. I'm told that 72% of all pastors report working between 55 and 75 hours a week. 84% of pastors feel that they're on call 24/7. 80% believe that pastoral ministry has negatively affected their families. 90% of pastors report the ministry was completely different than what they thought it would be like before they entered the ministry. 57% of the pastors do not feel that they receive a livable wage and they're unable to pay their bills. 52% of pastors feel overworked and can't seem to meet their church's unrealistic expectations. 40% report serious conflict with a parishioner at least once in the last 12 months. 70% of pastors report that they have a low self-image, or lower than when they first began doing the work of the ministry. And 70% of the pastors do not have someone that they consider to be a close and trusted friend. As a result, only 1 out of every 10 pastors ever actually retire as a pastor. And all of this serves as proof that ministry has an impact on the one doing the ministry. Regardless of what level God has called you to serve in, no one is exempt from the frustrations that go along with it. And that's why, as a result, 1,500 pastors left the ministry last month, and another 1,300 left their churches because they were terminated. And so there's a lot of frustration out there, and it's that frustration that I wish to speak to in this series. Jesus understands. He understood during his time here on the earth, and he understands now sitting at the right hand of the Father. He understands all of the struggles of the ministry. So I want to talk to those today that are called to do the bidding of the kingdom, called into some form of ministry, any ministry. I'm going to begin with a passage of Scripture, and that is a very familiar passage to all of us. Matthew chapter 13, I'll be reading verses 1 through 9. I'm reading out of the New International Version. That day Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him, and he got into a boat and sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, A farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell along thorns which grew up and choked the plants. Still, other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let him hear. And we know that this parable was given to a crowd on a beach. But the parable was undoubtedly directed toward those who have the responsibility of sowing the seed of the word. Or rather, as verse 19 put it, those who have the responsibility of sharing the, quote, message of the kingdom. This is a parable that we read 1,000 times, and often we've approached it from the perspective of the seed. But have you ever considered this parable from the perspective of the sower himself? So in this series, we'll be looking at the frustrations of a sower, its similarities to that of doing the work in the ministry. Now, in order to do this series justice, we can't look at the parable from the sower's point of view until we've taken a moment and looked at the seed portion of the parable. Jesus said there were 3 ways that the seed was unfruitful, and I want to look at those 3 ways if we can. First way was the seed was sown in the path. They heard, but they lacked understanding, because before the seed ever had an opportunity to germinate, the, quote, birds came and stole the seed. The evil one snatched it away because the people were under pressure. And in our ministries, we've all ministered to people that fit this description. Their lives are such a mess, and their situations are so hard that they are under such attack that the seed doesn't have an opportunity to germinate. They continue in their path until what is sown is completely stolen from them. And then there's the seed sown in the rocky places. The word is received with joy. They're passionate. They're exuberant. The seed seems to germinate, but for some reason that seed lacks root, maybe no discipleship. It grows only for a short time, and when things get hot, he falls away. Again, in our ministries, we've seen people who have received the word. They were very passionate in the beginning. They were hungry for everything that you could sow to them. But because they lacked any depth in discipleship, the first time something didn't go their way, you don't see them again. They have trouble, and then they start bringing every excuse as to why they can't continue. And then there is the seed that's sown amongst the thorns. The work you've done just literally gets choked out. The hearer hears the word, but because they have other priorities, that word gets choked out. Jesus said that it was because of their desire for wealth, but wealth is just another desire for self. So not only are they concerned about food, clothing, and shelter, now once they get food, clothing, and shelter, suddenly they want something better. They don't just want food, they want filet mignon. They don't just want clothes, they want designer clothing. They don't just want a house, but they have to have the biggest house on the block. They're interested in keeping up with the Joneses, if you will. But what they're after is pride, prestige, influence, and power. And again, in our ministries, we see people who have received the word, but they just couldn't fit it into their busy lives. They were just too busy. One of the big things here where I live is these people who have children that play ball. The soccer moms, they're so busy running up and down the highway to get their children to a soccer game that they don't have time to bring those same children to church. They're just too busy, and the seed of the word that was sown into them gets choked out by their schedule. But let me encourage you today that Jesus also said there's good ground available. It's good ground with varied returns. He said that some ground will produce 100-fold, some 60-fold, some 30-fold. And I want to speak to you today and tell you, first and foremost, don't get into the trap of comparing your returns with the pastor down the street, with somebody that's sitting on the same pew with you that's doing similar ministry. Don't get into the trap of comparing your harvest, your return, on the investment of time and energy that you've made, because Jesus said there would be different returns on our investment. But I want to also call your attention to the fact that Jesus never said that there was a zero return. He said 100, 60, or 30. He never said zero. And in spite of what you may be feeling or may be seeing, I promise you today that the Word of God does not return void. In other words, the work of the ministry that you're doing, you may not see the fruits here. You may not even see the fruits in your lifetime, but there will be fruit. You will have an impact on someone. Otherwise, God would have never called you to do what you're doing. He knew the return that you would have when he called you. So relax. Your calling is sure. The calling is permanent. As I've always told those in my mentorship team, the calling is permanent. The address is subject to change, and I need to add something to that as well. The return is also subject to change. I also want to call to your attention the fact that some people just may not be called to a 100-fold ministry. I'm reminded in Psalm chapter 139 where David, he's writing a song. It was for the director of music. He wrote a song. It says, it reads this way. It says, "You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise, you perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all of my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, Lord, you know it completely. You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me." Now watch this. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. Who knows? God may have called you to pastor a church of 30 all of your life. Or he may have called you to pastor a church of 30 that's going to bloom into 3,000. There's no way to know in advance the return that you're going to get on the seeds that you have sown. Fortunately for us in the kingdom, it is important to us to know that we're not called necessarily to the harvest. We're called to the obedience of sowing the seed. And frankly, there are just some things that are too wonderful for me. I have a pastor that pastors about a block away. He pastors a church is considered a mega church. It's probably 15, 20,000. God has not called me to pastor a church of 15 or 20,000. If he had, I'd be there. It's just too wonderful for me. I'm staying in my lane and executing the duties of the calling that God has placed upon my life. There are other things that affect your ministry returns that are often beyond your control. Those things include unity in the body. The fact is that you can't create unity yourself. There are a lot of times that the people that you have that God has called you to are in a constant state of confusion. So unity is one of the factors that affects your return on the seeds you've sown. The level of hunger in the people's lives affects the seeds that you have sown. There are people in other countries outside of America, and revival is happening all around the world. but yet here in America it seems to elude us. It's because there's a lack of hunger in the nation, and I believe that God's going to correct that, but it's going to come to us at a great cost. Also, one factor that will affect your return on your investment is the depth of the people that God has called you to. It may be that you're pastoring a group of new believers. It may be that God has called you to pastor a group of new believers, or He could call you to pastor a church that the believers there have been there for 50 years. The depth of their understanding, the depth and their sensitivity to what the Spirit is saying, it will affect the return on your investment. There's also the energy level. If you're pastoring seniors, their energy level will be much different than if you're pastoring youth. So the energy level will affect the return on the seeds you have sown. There's also the reputation of the church that you're pastoring. There's past hurts and baggage that your people may be carrying. And then there is also the abilities of the minister himself, whoever is doing the work of the ministry that you're in. So there are a lot of other factors that are beyond your ability to control that affects the seed that you're sowing and the return and the results you get from that sowing, the harvest. So next week we'll begin looking at the levels of frustration of ministry, and we'll approach this subject from the perspective of the sower. God bless you for tuning in. I look forward to seeing you here for the next session.